it's an exciting time for cosmology because everything has changed.
We are asking about ultimate things.
Seeing the fingerprint of God or the hallmarks of the Creator.
You see, in some sense, what is happening, our concept of what the universe is has changed.
The pendulum has kind of swung all the way over and got a bit back again on the Copernican principle.
Big Bang cosmology assumes that the only thing that exists is the physical world. There's nothing beyond that.
People want to save the existing models because there's a lot that's invested in them.
The standard model is a really good model. It fits the observations very, very well.
We have a conflict between what is a well-established mainstream thought and what is the testimony of experiments.
They've essentially run into dead ends.
This is the moment of truth because they have nowhere to go.
The colors we see here in the cosmic microwave background map are kind of like a weather map showing hotter and colder, showing how hot the radiation is that's coming from different places. This is just radio noise from our own Milky Way galaxy. We're supposed to see the same number and types of hot and cold spots in all directions because there is no up in the universe that's special. And that is sort of what we see, except not quite. This map here can be decomposed into what we call multipoles. You blur out all the little spots, and you still have the bigger ones remain. Like here is an area with a lot of blue. So when you smudge it, this will be one single big blue spot. Whereas when I smudge this, where there's a lot of red and yellow, it'll be one big blurry hot spot. On the very largest scales, we see a pattern of really big hot and cold spots which line up around a special axis, which has been dubbed the axis of evil. And it's quite puzzling. Why is there a special direction in space?
Our most recent large-scale observations challenge the basic assumption upon which our modern scientific worldview rests, the Copernican principle. If the principle is wrong, it could mean that everything we think we know about our universe is wrong.
All of us are born with an innate need. In fact, it's hardwired into us to answer the question, who are we? Where did we come from? What does it all mean?
Was there a beginning? And if there was a beginning, was there a creator?
Cosmology used to be a very flaky subject, somewhere out there between philosophy and metaphysics.
In the early days, cosmology was really very much a matter of almost speculating about the universe without the data.
Because there weren't any empirical proofs for what they were finding. There were theories.
Cosmology, the study of the origins, structures, laws, and ultimate fate of the universe.
Now the remarkable thing about cosmology is that we have the data.
What counts as science and what doesn't?
Traditionally, people have said, well, once you get to the Big Bang itself, you're in the domain of philosophy or even theology. So it doesn't make sense to ask the question, what happened at the Big Bang, let alone what happened before the Big Bang.
Philosophy was useful before we had natural science. Namely, you can speculate about the origin of the universe, but you can speculate till the cows come home. But until you measure things and predict things, you don't know if they happen.
But today, we think we have it. We think we have the theory of all creation, the theory of everything.
The theory of everything. The system of the world. It has always been the dream of scientists, and earlier of philosophers and theologians, to achieve a consistent and complete description of reality. In the book of Genesis, God tells Abraham, "Look up and number the stars, if you can." This is the beginning of faith and the beginning of science. In the beginning, they're both the same thing. It was the natural assumption of the ancient world to see the movements in the heavens as centered upon us. From the location of Stonehenge, near Salisbury, England, we can see the standing ruins of what may be the very first astronomical observatory, constructed from an Earth-centered, fixed viewpoint around which the heavens revolve. If we imagine ourselves standing on a fixed world at a latitude of 51 degrees during the summer, the circle of the sun seems to rise toward the North Pole, giving us the long days of summer. Over the full course of the year, the circle of the sun will rise and fall 23.5 degrees. Add stars, and our world can be described by this diagram.
Has there ever been an experiment done to prove that the Earth is revolving around the sun?
Yes, there was several experiments in the 1800s. Dominique Arago, Armand Fuseau, Augustin Fresnel, but one of the most famous was the Michaelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution. And they found out that it wasn't moving and it's very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
well,
what they
if
found?
the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one that's going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south. Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
Wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass
yes.
was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof.
Not that I'm surprised, you understand.
Yeah.
I know what the scientific community is capable of in terms of mass deception. Evolution is a mass deception. But I wasn't aware that they don't really have any even purported scientific confirmation in terms of physical measurement.
No, nobody
contraction effect.
Nobody measured a contraction. But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what he admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michaelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Can you give an approximate page reference for me in your book? I want to go back and read that right away.
I'll send you an email. I'll show you where it is.
In his 1881 and 1887 experiments, Albert Michaelson discovered the Earth was not moving around the sun. As Michaelson himself described the results of his experiment, this conclusion directly contradicts the explanation, which presupposes that the Earth moves. But since his colleagues, including Albert Einstein, were die-hard Copernicans who didn't want to believe that Michaelson had discovered a motionless Earth, they proposed his experimental apparatus was distorted by Earth's motion through space, and thus Michelson's apparatus only made it appear as if the Earth wasn't moving. In scientific parlance, we call this the fallacy of petitio principii. That is, using as proof a moving Earth the very thing one is trying to prove, a moving Earth. Let me explain. The first light beam was pointed westward because it was the presumed direction of the Earth's movement around the sun. The second light beam was pointed northward and thus away from the direction of the presumed moving Earth. The first light beam should have been affected by Earth's movement through space if the Earth is moving around the sun at an accepted speed of 66,000 miles per hour. If so, the first beam would have traveled slower than the second beam of light. But that didn't happen. Both light beams traveled at nearly the same speed. According to Michaelson, the first beam traveled only about 1/6 of the speed needed if the Earth was moving around the sun. The conclusion, as Michaelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the sun. Other prominent physicists have noted the same truth. There was just one alternative. The Earth's true velocity through space might happen to have been nil. Physicist Arthur Eddington. The data of the Michelson-Morley test were almost unbelievable. There was only one other possible conclusion to draw, that the Earth was at rest. Bernard Jaffe. Thus, failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment to observe different speeds of light at different times of the year suggested that the Earth must be at rest, and it was therefore the preferred frame for measuring absolute motion in space. Yet we have known since Galileo that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Why should it be at rest in space? Adolf Baker. The easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to the Earth in the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean, in effect, that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe, with all the other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it. James Coleman. The Michelson-Morley experiment confronted scientists with an embarrassing alternative. On one hand, they could scrap the ether theory, which had explained so many things about electricity, magnetism, and light, or if they insisted on retaining the ether, they had to abandon the still more venerable Copernican theory that the Earth is in motion. To many physicists, it seemed almost easier to believe that the Earth stood still than that waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, could exist without a medium to sustain them. It was a serious dilemma, and one that split scientific thought for a quarter of a century. Many new hypotheses were advanced and rejected. The experiment was tried again by Morley and by others, with the same conclusion. The apparent velocity of the Earth through the ether was zero. Lincoln Barnett, forward by Albert Einstein. What happened when the experiment was done in 1887? There was never in any orientation at any time of the year any shift in the interference pattern. None. No shift, no fringe shift, nothing. What's the implication? Here was an experiment that was done to measure the speed of the Earth's motion through the ether. This was an experiment that was 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be. It could have detected speeds as low as 2 miles per second instead of the known 20 miles per second that the Earth moves on its orbital motion around the sun. It didn't detect it. What's the conclusion from the Michelson-Morley experiment? The implication is that the Earth is not moving. Richard Wolfson. Michaelson and Morley found shifts in the interference fringes, but they were very much smaller than the size of the effect expected from the known orbital motion of the Earth. John D. Norton. This null result was one of the greatest puzzles of physics at the end of the 19th century. One possibility was that velocity would be zero and no fringe shift would be expected. But this implies that the Earth is somehow a preferred object. Only with respect to the Earth would the speed of light be c as predicted by Maxwell's equations. This is tantamount to assuming that the Earth is the central body of the universe. Douglas C. Giancoldi. But the die-hard Copernicans of that day were not about to accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment. They knew the catastrophic scientific, cultural, and religious implications if it was experimentally shown that the Earth is fixed in space. In a word, the whole world would have been turned upside down, literally and figuratively. Pressured to provide a scientific answer to the world, they searched for a way to make it appear that the first light beam did indeed provide sixth of the speed required for an Earth moving around the sun. To do so, they thought up an ingenious but devious explanation. As noted above, they claimed the Earth's movement around the sun contracted the metal enclosure in which the first light beam traveled. If the length of the housing was contracted, then the first light beam does not need to travel as far as when the housing is not contracted. This would account for why the speed of the two light beams did not differ much. With this contrived explanation, they proposed to the world that the contraction of Michelson's apparatus was the reason the Earth appeared to be motionless. In effect, if someone said to them, "You claim the Earth is moving, but you admit you cannot detect that movement by any experiment," they would retort, "Well, we can't detect it because every time we try to do so, the length of the experimental apparatus shrinks just enough to conceal the movement, which makes it impossible to measure the Earth's movement." Again, we see the fallacy of petitio principii in play. From start to finish, the whole enterprise was ad hoc. Length contraction wasn't even contemplated previously, much less was it an established fact of science. But in this emergency situation, length contraction was invented on the spot so that the science establishment would have at least some hypothetical answer as to why Michelson's experiment showed the Earth was motionless. Everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. The irony, as of this date, is that no one has ever detected a length contraction in a moving object. In fact, modern physicists can't even agree on what length contraction is or how it would be manifested. Since they insist the Earth is moving around the sun, yet cannot detect it moving, nevertheless, they needed some physical and mathematical way of accounting for it, since there is obviously a difference between motion and non-motion. So length contraction became their convenient scapegoat. This is the essence of the special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. It was invented solely to answer Michelson's experiment, as Einstein himself said. To the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, we have already remarked that all attempts of this nature led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled by this negative result. Whereas in 1892, Hendrik Lorentz had hypothesized that the ether of space was what caused the contraction, Einstein decided to dispense with ether and attribute the cause to relative motion. In effect, Lorentz at least proposed a physical cause for his claims of length contraction, but Einstein never explained how relative motion could shrink objects. Hence, during his day, various philosophers accused him of violating the principle of cause and effect. So whatever the cause of the contraction, in order to give the ad hoc theory some semblance of credibility, the required amount for the metal enclosure to contract was put into a mathematical equation called the Lorentz transform. It has become the most famous and most used equation in modern physics. Essentially, whatever tests disagree with their belief that the Earth was moving around the sun could now be mathematically transformed into their desired result, as well as give the semblance of being scientific. But the transform of length required another transform. Since they contracted the length, they also had to dilate the time, since if a moving object has its length contracted, it is not going to get from point A to point B in the same time as when it is not contracted. To increase the time of travel, they use the same transform equation as above, but since they are increasing instead of decreasing, they turn the multiplier into a divider to get the following equation. Of course, just as there is no proof that length contracts, there is no proof that time dilates. They just need it to make everything appear to balance if they are going to insist that the Earth is moving around the sun when the empirical evidence says that it's not. It's easy for them. They just put up a theory and represent it by a mathematical equation to erase any discrepancies the experiment shows against their theory. The transforms are not over. They must also add mass increase, since if a moving object has its length contracted, then it will have a larger mass per unit volume when it gets to point B. So to make the mass larger, they use the same exact transform equation as for time dilation. Often in the debate over the relevance of Michelson's experiment, the issue of inertial frames presents itself. An inertial frame is one in which an object is at rest or is moving in uniform motion and not accelerating or decelerating. If the Earth is moving around the Sun, it is a non-inertial frame since it is accelerating. In physics, all objects that move in a circle are considered accelerating, even though they go the same speed. As such, one is hampered when doing experiments on Earth due to the effects of acceleration on the apparatus. So, in order to make Michelson's experiment valid, that is, one that takes place in an inertial frame, a relativist will create the inertial frame by the above transform equations. Once again, it is easy to see the fallacy of petitio principii at work in their thinking. For those who accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment, that the Earth is not moving, the Earth is already shown to be an inertial frame because it is at an absolute rest. Thus there is no need to create inertial frames for the Earth, and thus no need to use a transform equation. Incidentally, we should note one more important facet of Michelson's experiment before we move on. We saw above that the experiment showed only 1/6 of what was required for an Earth moving around the Sun. This 1/6 is important for another reason. It showed that space was composed of something substantive. The name given to it by Lorentz, Maxwell, and all other scientists was ether. No one knew precisely what it was composed of, but they correctly deducted that space cannot be nothing, since metaphysically nothing cannot exist. Space must be something composed of something physical, although, like air, we cannot see it because it is invisible. It doesn't matter what you call it, the fact is it must exist. Quantum mechanics has suggested that the ether's basic component is Planck particles, which are 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the electron. Another type of ether may be the electron-positron dipole particle, which was discovered in 1932 by Carl Anderson. In any case, the substance of space, which we call ether, is detected in Michelson's 1881 and 1887 experiments, as well as his 1897 experiment with an above-ground apparatus. Since light moves so fast, it can serve to measure the effect on something as small as ether particles. His interferometer was so accurate it could measure 100 times more than it was required to measure. As such, Michelson's interferometer didn't measure enough ether to match an Earth moving at 66,000 miles per hour around the Sun, but it did measure a little ether. Otherwise, his results would not have shown 1/6, but 0/6 of ether presence. Michelson noted the small presence on his 1887 paper. The actual displacement was certainly less than the 20th part of this, and probably less than the 40th part. But since the displacement is proportional to the square of the velocity, the relative velocity of Earth in the ether is probably less than 1/6 of the Earth's orbital velocity, and certainly less than 1/4. This was not good for Einstein. He candidly admitted that if any ether was detected, even a little bit, his theory of special relativity would automatically be falsified. This was noted in Einstein's statement to Sir Hubert Samuel in Jerusalem. If Michelson morally is wrong, then relativity is wrong. In other words, Einstein was forced to assume that because Michelson did not find enough ether for an Earth revolving around the Sun, then Michelson couldn't have found any ether. But if this conclusion of Einstein's was wrong, then his whole relativity theory would be falsified automatically, since even a little ether would act as an absolute frame and thus nullify relativity. Noted physicist Charles Lane Poore of Columbia University reiterated the problem. The Michelson-Morley experiment forms the basis of the relativity theory. Einstein calls it decisive. If it should develop that there is a measurable ether drift, then the entire fabric of the relativity theory would collapse like a house of cards. So Einstein was banking on the hope that since Michelson did not detect the required amount of ether for the Earth moving around the Sun, he could conclude that the ether simply didn't exist. Hence, the detection of 1/6 of the required ether was thus conveniently chalked up to experimental error. The facts show otherwise, however. Every interferometer experiment performed from Michaelson in 1881 to Juice in 1930, which is 50 years of the same results from a dozen different experimenters, detected 1/6 to 1/10. Einstein was so bothered by this fact that he hired what can be called a scientific hitman, Robert Shankland, to seek to discredit the experiments, especially the most comprehensive interferometer experiments performed by Dayton Miller between 1908 and 1921. But at this point in time, the 1910s and 1920s, the world was only too happy to accept Einstein's theories and reject anyone who challenged him. After all, Einstein was the Earth mover. He made the Earth move around the sun and thus saved mankind from having to admit that popular science had misled the world for over 500 years. For the geocentrist, the only thing left to answer is, from where did 1/6 of ether originate? The simple answer is, since the universe with its ether is rotating around a fixed Earth, some of that ether spilled into Michelson's 1887 interferometer when he was trying to detect if the Earth was moving around the sun. This is confirmed by the fact that Michelson did another experiment in 1925 in order to measure the ether movement for the daily rotation between space and Earth. In that experiment, he found 6/6 of the required ether for a daily rotation. Hence, it is logical to assume that the 1/6 he found in 1887 came from the same ether he later detected in his 1925 experiment. Since the ether in his 1887 experiment hit the interferometer orthogonally instead of linearly, it would only pick up 1/6 of the total ether in space. You will often hear modern devotees of Einstein claim that he invented special relativity as an answer to Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics. They do this because they don't want to admit that Einstein invented special relativity for the express purpose of making it appear the Earth was moving around the sun. They want to make it appear that Einstein invented special relativity out of the pure motives and an independent thought process. The truth is far different. Einstein himself admits the only reason he invented special relativity was due to Michelson's discovery. He writes in 1922, "Soon I came to the conclusion that our idea about the motion of the Earth with respect to the ether is incorrect if we admit Michelson's null result as a fact. This was the first path which led me to the theory of special relativity." Be that as it may, the reason the relativist wants to intrude on Maxwell's electrodynamic theory is because, as it stands, electromagnetism doesn't show any characteristics of being relative. Maxwell's experiments from 1865 show us that the effect of an electric coil moving over a stationary magnet is different than a magnet moving over a stationary electric coil, and Maxwell appropriately represented these different reactions by two different equations. Maxwell's experiment and his two equations, actually 4 equations altogether, but with 2 main equations, thus show that space and the reactions that occur in it are absolute, not relative, since it distinguishes between the 2 different effects of the electric coil and the magnet, respectively. Since a relativist does not like anything absolute, Einstein sought to make Maxwell's experiment relative, just as he tried to make Michelson's experiment relative. To do so, he used the same transform equations that he had used to make it appear the Earth was moving. As such, the relativist can make it appear that any effect of electricity on magnetism is the same as magnetism on electricity, but in reality they are not the same. We still use Maxwell's equations today because they are correct, but when the relativist uses them, he must invariably inject the transform equations in order to make Maxwell's 2 absolute reactions into Einstein's 1 relative reaction. Without the transform equation, Maxwell's findings are diametrically opposed to Einstein's relativity theory. Not surprisingly, Einstein was well aware that Maxwell's findings of the different reactions between an electric coil and a magnet are related to Michelson's unsuccessful attempt to discover any motion of the Earth. In his famous 1905 paper, he seeks to make their respective absolute effects into relative effects. He writes, "It is known that Maxwell's electrodynamics, as usually understood at the present time, when applied to moving bodies, leads to asymmetries which do not appear to be inherent in the phenomena. Take, for example, the reciprocal electrodynamic action of a magnet and a conductor. The observable phenomena here depends only on the relative motion of the conductor and the magnet, whereas the customary view draws a sharp distinction between the two cases in which either one of the bodies are in motion. For if the magnet is in motion and the conductor is at rest, then arises in the neighborhood of the magnet an electric field with a certain definite energy, producing a current at the place where parts of the conductor are situated. But if the magnet is stationary and the conductor is in motion, no electric field arises in the neighborhood of the magnet. In the conductor, however, we find an electromotive force, to which in itself there is no corresponding energy, but which gives rise, assuming equality of relative motion in the two cases discussed, to electric currents of the same path and intensity as those produced by the electric forces in the former case. Examples of this sort, together with the unsuccessful attempts to discover any motion of the Earth relatively to the light medium, suggest that the phenomena of electrodynamics as well as of mechanics possess no properties corresponding to the idea of absolute rest. They suggest rather that, as has already been shown to the first order of small quantities, the same laws of electrodynamics and optics will be valid for all frames of reference for which the equations of mechanics hold good. In other words, since Einstein firmly believes that the Earth is moving around the Sun, and yet he realizes that he must have an answer for all of the unsuccessful attempts to discover any motion of the Earth, he proposes that the discrepancy can be dealt with by 1. Assuming as a fact that electrodynamics and mechanics did not show states of absolute rest. Michaelson did not show us a motionless Earth, and Maxwell did not show us the absolute state of electricity and magnetism. And 2, we are thus obligated to change what appeared to be absolute frames in Michelson's and Maxwell's experiments into relative frames, which is noted in his phrase, all frames of reference. In order to do so, that is, in order to make all frames of reference to be valid, Einstein will use the transform equation, which appears on page 7 of his 1905 paper as follows. This is the precise equation used by Lorentz to claim that the arm of Michelson's apparatus had shrunk, with Einstein also adding time dilation. The section of the paper where this transform equation appears begins on page 5 with the title, Theory of the Transformation of Coordinates and Times from a Stationary System to Another System in Uniform Motion of Translation Relativity to the former. Alas, we don't need to go searching for it. Einstein tells us quite candidly what he is doing. He is transforming space and time from a stationary system, a fixed Earth, to another system, one of relativity. In fact, the word transformation appears 24 times in this paper as he applies it to every phenomena from time, space, motion, electricity, magnetism, the Doppler effect, stellar aberration, energy of light waves, electron acceleration, to mass increase. It becomes quintessential means to relativize the whole universe and forever banish the thought of a motionless Earth. As we can see, it is all done by mathematics. There is not one iota of physical, empirical evidence to prove the theory. In the relativist mind, of course, there is no need to prove their findings or to justify their transform, since everyone knows the Earth is moving around the Sun, and everything is moving, and there is no object at rest, and thus the whole universe is relative. In effect, whenever the experiments show an absolute result, the relativist can wave his magic wand and change it into a relative result. This is the essence of special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. That Einstein believes the Earth is moving, but has no proof for it, as noted in his statement, I have come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment, though the Earth is revolving around the Sun. Einstein's admission merely begs the question, if one scientific basis, he can't detect the Earth moving, how does he know the Earth is moving? The truth is, he doesn't know. He just assumes it to be so, since that is what he has been taught since childhood. In fact, the transform equation is then invoked to make it appear as if the Earth is moving around the Sun, but in reality, the transform equation is just an equation that has no ability or authority to determine the issue. Hence, Einstein would admit in 1938. The possibility of solving these difficulties depends on the answer to the following question. Can we formulate physical laws so that they are valid for all coordinate systems, not only those moving uniformly, but also those moving quite arbitrarily relative to each other? If this can be done, our difficulties will be over. We shall then be able to apply the laws of nature to any coordinate system. The struggle so violent in the early days of science between the views of Ptolemy and Copernicus would then be quite meaningless. Either coordinate system could be used with equal justification. The two sentences, the sun is at rest and the earth moves, or the sun moves and the earth is at rest, would quite simply mean two different conventions concerning two different coordinate systems. That is, he will employ arbitrary coordinate systems to make the absolute state, a fixed earth, into either coordinate system can be used, a fixed earth or a moving earth. All the coordinate systems are created mathematically out of thin air by using the transform equation. If they didn't use the transform equation, then they would be stuck with only one coordinate system, the one Michaelson found in 1887 when the experimental evidence showed the earth wasn't moving around the sun. If you ask a relativist for the scientific validity of using the transform equation, he will simply retort, well, the transform equation was proven to be valid when Michaelson did his experiment in 1887. Again, the fallacy of petitio principii is readily apparent since he is using an unproven fact, an earth is moving around the sun, as the basis for making the conclusion that the earth is moving around the sun. The cause of the fallacy, as Einstein admitted above when he said, though the earth is revolving around the sun, is that they insist on using a moving earth which they claim to know intuitively as the indisputable authority to interpret Michelson's experiment. Consequently, if one firmly believes the earth is moving, but the experiments show it is not moving, then one's interpretation of the experiment will force one to find some way to make it appear that the earth is moving. In effect, any experiment that shows the earth is not moving will be magically transformed into a moving earth by the transform equation. The transform equation is like a magician waving his wand over the experiments so that the system one does not prefer is transformed into a system one does prefer. Many modern men certainly do not prefer a fixed earth, since a fixed earth would validate much of the history and science prior to our modern age and would show modern man that he is not the objective and non-prejudiced icon of society that he has enjoyed for the last few hundred years. He is little more than a magician who has been feeding the world a steady diet of illusions. All in all, the history of the Michaelson experiment show how a preconceived idea, the earth moves around the sun, is made the sole determining factor of how modern scientist is going to interpret the results of any experiment. In order to hold on to his preconceived idea, he will introduce mitigating factors onto the experimental results, and usually this is done by hypothetical concepts and fudged mathematics. The scientist thus convinces himself that because he can invent a mathematical equation that can transform the empirical results, he can keep his preconceived idea of how he thinks the universe must operate. In his mind, the ends justify the means, because he knows the earth revolves around the sun. There is nothing that would make mankind happier than to keep believing that the earth moves around the sun, regardless of what the experiments show. Their God from on high, Albert Einstein, showed them a magical way to avoid such a predicament, and the world has accepted Einstein as a god ever since. His transform equation has become the magic wand to turn a fixed earth absolute universe into an earth-wandering relative universe, as noted by Einstein biographer Abraham Pais put it. A new man appears abruptly, the suddenly famous Dr. Einstein. He carries the message of a new order of the universe. He is a new Moses come down from the mountain to bring a new law and a new Joshua controlling the motion of the heavenly bodies. The new man who appears at the time represents order and power. He becomes the Theos Aner, the divine man of the 20th century.
ancient Greek scientists could produce these gear systems 2,000 years ago, the whole history of Western technology would have to be rewritten.
And it is done on a flat model. But anyway, so think about this, people, especially the newbies out there. You know, they're telling us that the Earth is going around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. And then, of course, the sun going around the Milky Way at 483,000 miles an hour. And then when we get up to the Milky Way going around to the Great Attractor, we are at 1,300,000 miles per hour. And this has been going on for millennia, and the skies have never changed. What is their excuse? Oh, the stars are so far away, you'd never know. And relativity, right? Bunch of nonsense.
Yeah. It upsets all our ideas about what the ancient Greeks were capable of. It rewrites the history of technology. It tells us that things were going on in 2nd century BC Greece, which we had no idea about.
And anybody that thinks that just because it was 2,000 years ago that these people were in the dark, are you ever wrong? Because they probably surpassed us in several areas of engineering than what we are even at today. In fact, I'm sure they have, and I think that a lot of that has been hidden from us and is somewhere down in a Vatican, archive when they tried to suppress all this knowledge. So yeah,
well, I think it's safe to say that the ancients actually had an advantage over us because they were taught how to think and how to reason, whereas modern education is more along the lines of indoctrination, where we're taught how to follow rules, read from a book, and regurgitate information.
Yeah, absolutely true. The ballers will want to step in and say, oh yeah, well the ball Earth model, the globe Earth model has predicted eclipses for centuries successfully, which of course is just BS. The flat Earth model was around long before that, and they were predicting eclipses with astounding accuracy. But for the ballers to just walk in and kind of usurp all the credit, for which model is capable. And in fact, most of the ballers today will say that it's impossible to do eclipse predictions on a flat Earth, which, of course, again, is nonsense. And this particular 2,100-year-old device proves otherwise. And in fact, because 2,100 years ago, regardless of what you may think about Eratosthenes and the confusion that surrounds that, this is something that is absolutely, physical proof that we do have this piece of science from over 2 millennia ago that is based on a flat Earth cosmology and absolutely does predict the eclipses. But guys, don't ever let these ballers tell you that the eclipses cannot be predicted from a flat Earth model, because in fact, that is exactly how it always has been done.
Drawing on mathematics and geometry, the ancient Greeks developed astronomy and calculated the motions of the sun, moon, and major planets, which they thought rotated around a stationary Earth.
And what I ended up with was models of the planets. This is a model of the Greek cosmos, geocentric. You can think of this cover plate in the middle as representing the Earth, and everything goes round it. The easy one to spot is the moon, because that's the fastest moving thing on the dial, and it's the front pointer. The night sky was the ancient Greek television. What else were you going to look at night? People were much, much more aware of the sky. The calendar was organized according to the moon. Official positions changed. Debts became payable on the new moon. You had to have a calendar that in some way reconciled the year controlled by the sun with the month controlled by the moon. They're tricky numbers, and they're built into the model.
If we imagine ourselves standing on a fixed world at a latitude of 51 degrees during the summer, the circle of the sun seems to rise toward the North Pole, giving us the long days of summer. Over the full course of the year, the circle of the sun will rise and fall 23.5 degrees. Add stars, and our world can be described by this diagram. Ptolemy refined a system with Earth at the center, and the puzzling back and forth motions of the planets as seen from Earth attributed to a series of epicycles, deferent and equant. The general assumption at the time was that the heavenly bodies should move in perfect, uniform circles, and Ptolemy's addition of the epicycles disturbed this metaphysical notion.
Ironically, the problem with the Ptolemaic system was a particular feature in it, which was actually, in my opinion, by far the greatest discovery made in antiquity. He had the planets moving on what was called a deferent, non-uniformly. He broke the hallowed tradition that everything must move at a uniform speed on a perfect circle. And he was forced to do that because his theory, which initially had that property, didn't fit the data.
In that regard, it should be kept in mind that if you look at pictures of medieval cosmology, then you see not only the Earth and the planets, but the outer sphere. Beyond that, you would have heaven. So that the Earth was considered to be at rest, ultimately, with respect to heaven, with respect to the throne of God.
For 1,500 years, Ptolemy's system was used as the basis of astronomy and calendars, and it worked quite well. But there were always those who detested its departure from the purely uniform, circular motion, assumed to be perfect and appropriate for heavenly bodies. Among these was Nicolaus Copernicus.
Copernicus hated that, and Copernicus set about to undo Ptolemy's greatest discovery.
While working at the request of Pope Leo X on improvements to the Julian calendar, Copernicus conceived what turned out to be the foundational idea of modernity itself, the idea that the Earth moved.
The Copernican principle is theological dynamite.
Because Copernicus, we started off with the geocentric view, and Copernicus showed that that is wrong, that actually it's the sun is the center of the universe as it's seen then, the Earth goes around the sun. So then we had the heliocentric view.
Copernicus told us that we're not the center of the universe. Well, certainly not the center of the solar system. The sun doesn't go around the Earth goes around the sun.
That's the Copernican principle, that if we are not really special, then this gigantic universe of ours doesn't care about us. We are nothing, absolute nothing.
In the context of cosmology, this is called the cosmological principle. So the point is that we might think we're at the center of the universe because it looks, everything should look pretty symmetric as we look around us, around the sky, but actually any other observer would see the same thing.
It's the basis of the standard cosmologies, and it's taken for granted by almost everybody in cosmology.
When Copernicus first came along and said, hey, we humans are not so special and everything centers around us, a lot of people viewed this Copernican principle as something bad.
The Copernican revolution is the revolution of the mobility of the Earth.
Copernican principle leads to, ultimately, the idea that there is no God.
That we are nothing compared to the splendorous universe of ours.
I think it was actually one of the greatest things that ever happened to us. We had this arrogance, and we got it knocked out of us. And we realized that actually we're not the center of everything, so we can't just say, oh, I'm not going to look at what the world looks like because I have a book here or my authority told me this is how it is. I don't need to do observations, and instead say, hey, it doesn't all center around us. We humans have to be humble. We have to look and ask Mother Nature, how do you work?
Not all were persuaded by Copernicus, however. The greatest astronomer of the time, Tycho Brahe, developed a new geocentric model. The Earth occupies the center, the planets orbit the sun, and the sun orbits the Earth.
Tycho Brahe, who is a great unsung hero of this, because he did an immense number of observations, very accurate ones, very precise for a long period of time.
Well, the Tychonic geocentric system, the sun is traveling around the Earth literally and carrying the planets with it. So the sun is making the ecliptic, it's not the Earth.
Tycho hired a young assistant named Johannes Kepler in 1600. Kepler, working on his own development of the Copernican system, needed Tycho's observations, but Tycho refused to part with them. When Tycho died suddenly and mysteriously in 1601, Kepler took charge of Tycho's observations and used them to develop his own system.
Kepler's great insight was that the sun must be playing a significant role in the motion of the planets. They are following very definite paths. We know that for sure. How on earth do they do it? And what moves them? So he said the sun must be somehow causing them to go round. So he postulated that the sun is rotating and had sort of spokes, which somehow got weaker as you were further from the sun.
In Kepler's system, the sun is in the center, while the planets move on ellipses, non-uniformly. The ellipse, with its two foci, allows us to see that Ptolemy's epicycles and equant were actually a brilliant attempt to express non-uniform motion centuries before Kepler. Indeed, once the concept of non-uniform motion is introduced, all of these systems can be shown to be geometrically identical. It was Kepler's idea that the sun must somehow be moving the planets in their orbits that set the stage for Isaac Newton's great breakthroughs. But observational tools equal to the task would first have to be developed.
Now, it's good old Galileo was the first person in the modern age who made this clear. He made the distinction between what I think it's Locke, then the philosopher Locke, described as primary qualities and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are the shapes of objects and the way they move and the space in which they move.
Galileo employed the telescope to establish that Jupiter was itself orbited by moons. This contradicted Ptolemy's idea that all bodies orbited the Earth, and was seen as proof that the Earth must likewise orbit a much larger body, the Sun. For the first time, observational science claimed to have established an error in the Church's understanding of Scripture, and the first great battle between faith and science was joined.
The criticism has been made back in Galileo's time that it was the church that was controlling knowledge, only allowing people to think within certain boundaries.
Science and theology were wed together. They were one basic entity. Theology always had a supremacy over science.
After years of house arrest, but seemingly quite sincerely nonetheless, Galileo eventually recanted.
A year before Galileo died, he rejected the heliocentric or Copernican universe that he had defended for about 30 years. A friend of his named Francesco Rinuccini came to him because he thought he had evidence from this astronomer named Giovanni Perioni to prove that the Earth was moving. And so they brought this evidence to Galileo, and Galileo said, well, there's no way I'm going to accept this. And it was a very long letter that he wrote, explaining the theology, the science, and everything he needed to explain that Perioni couldn't have found proof that the Earth was moving. Rinuccini got the letter, and as soon as he got it and read it, he erased Galileo's signature off the letter because he didn't want anybody to know that Galileo had finally repented of his heliocentric views.
However, when Giordano Bruno's ideas were similarly condemned, Bruno resisted to the bitter end.
Giordano Bruno got burnt at the stake the year 1600 for writing about an infinite space.
He was burned alive in the streets of Rome in the year 1600 for simply saying that there are other worlds out there, that there's nothing essentially special about our world. So why would the Catholic Church burn this person alive in the streets of Rome? Because think about it. If there are other worlds, then the question is, are there people on these other planets? If so, do they have a savior? If so, do they have a pope? If so, how many saints do they have? Imagine 1 billion popes, 1 trillion saints. How many trinities are there? The mind goes crazy contemplating a universe of universes. And so what did the church do? They simply burned him alive.
Bruno told his inquisitors at his sentencing, "It may be that you fear more to deliver judgment upon me than I fear judgment." Henceforth, science would increasingly assert its independence from the influence of the church. Extending Kepler's famous laws of planetary motion, Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica in 1687. This most influential work in all of scientific history introduced Newton's theory of universal gravitation, the first and still the greatest attempt to construct a true system of the world.
When Newton came with his theory in the late 1600s, it was felt by many people that he had resolved the whole situation, the choice between Copernicus and Tycho, by means of his equations for mechanics.
But what happened was people misunderstood what Newton really said.
And actually, what Newton said was that both Copernicus and Tycho would have been wrong, because neither the sun nor the Earth would be the center of the solar system or universe, but you'd have to look at centers of mass and things of that nature.
He didn't say that the smaller goes around the larger. He said that both bodies go around the center of mass. So even in the heliocentric system, it's not the Earth going around the sun. Scientifically and technically, we would say that the Earth and the sun are going around one point called the center of mass. It just so happens that Newton agrees that you could have a rotating star field, and if you do, then the center of mass is going to be somewhere in the middle of that rotating star field. And it just so happens that any object can occupy that center of mass. What that does is it nullifies the objection that the smaller always has to go around the larger. That would be true in 99.999% of the universe, but there's one place where that wouldn't be true, and that's where that star field is rotating around the center of mass.
Newton had introduced the idea of absolute space and time, which is something a bit like, as regards space, which is the more important concept, a bit like this room, a rigid framework in which you can sensibly say that a thing is moving in a straight line.
Newton's theory was based on the idea of an absolute space through which objects could be shown to be in motion. His famous bucket experiment was designed to show that motion was not relative, but had to be occurring within absolute space.
Newton had hung a bucket full of water in his room in Cambridge, and he'd wound the bucket round, then held it still with the cord of the rope all twisted, and the water in the bucket level. Then he'd let go of the bucket, and the bucket had started to spin, and its centrifugal force makes it go up the side of the bucket. And Newton argues from that concavity of the water surface can't be explained by relative motion, because when the relative motion between the bucket wall and the water was greatest, the water was flat, and when it had stopped and there was no relative motion, the concavity was greatest.
Newton argues, therefore, there must be an absolute space that allows us to say that motion is not relative.
Newton didn't provide a mechanism. He just provided the behaviors of objects in gravitational fields. He never accounted for what caused the field.
So although it was widely thought that Newton had proven the Earth to be in absolute motion, this was by no means proven to everyone's satisfaction.
Physicist Ernst Mach provided an alternate explanation. According to Mach's principle, the Earth could be considered as the pivot point of the universe. The fact that the universe is orbiting around the Earth will create the exact same forces that we usually ascribe to the motion of the Earth. Mach's ideas would strongly influence the later development of the theory of relativity.
And Mach's principle says that you should get exactly the same effects whether the Earth is rotating in the universe or whether the Earth is fixed and the universe is rotating about it. Motion is relative. All the objects in the universe must be moving relative to each other. Mach's principle that because all we observe is relative motion, then once you start talking about absolute motion, that means you've imported a metaphysical principle into the system. Mach had such absolute conviction that motion must be relative. He said, well, actually, it's nothing to do with the Earth rotating relative to absolute space. It's the Earth and the stars are in relative rotation. There's a relative rotation between them.
Rotation is relative. That is, you cannot tell by measuring centrifugal and inertial forces whether you are rotating or the universe is rotating, because you will see the same effect no matter which one it is.
And Mach then said, that's the cause of the ablation of the Earth, that it's not a perfect sphere. Whenever there is relative rotation, however you like to look at it, there will be that effect. And in fact, he goes back and says you can actually look at this from either the Ptolemaic or the Copernican point of view. You have to just concentrate on what is objectively true.
The other. Michaelson Morley couldn't measure any effect of Earth's orbit, even though the assumption was at the time that that would affect the measured speed of light.
I've heard it said that there are 7 continents in the world, and one of them has never been seen by a woman, and that's Antarctica. Is that actually true?
Well, if the Peloponnesian is an island, 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 as far as I know, that's true. No woman's ever stepped foot upon the Antarctic continent, and it's the most peaceful place in the world.
A couple of years ago, I was asked to do a Bible study group. I'm thinking Catholics don't do Bible studies, you know. And to do a Bible study group in Houston. I mean, Catholics definitely don't do Bible studies in Texas. To do a Bible study group in Houston with a bunch of astronauts. Astronauts, oh, I could do that, yeah. So I wound up at a dinner evening of about 12 couples, all of them astronauts and spouses. One of the guys, half of them were Catholic, as it turns out, so much for Catholics not doing Bible studies. One of the guys came up to me and said, you know, I just want to let you know, I believe in the absolute truth that creation was made in the 6 days just as described in the book of Genesis. And that's my religion. I just want to let you know that ahead of time. And I'm thinking, you know, have you actually read Genesis? Where it says the world is flat and it's covered with a dome and there's water above and below the dome, you know. Where does the shuttle go? How come you don't get wet?
Dude who jumped out of a perfectly good balloon. What's his name? Felix Baumgartner. He would have been about 2 millimeters above the surface of this globe. That's his edge of space jump. Now, you know, I don't. It's fine. He wants to. I don't have a problem if he does it, but the honesty of it would greatly diminish what I think people thought he was actually doing. And not only that, they made sure to photograph him standing there with a really wide-angle lens, which curves horizontal lines. So in the photo, you see this curvature of Earth's surface, and he said, wow, he's in space. Look at that. No, he's not. At that height, you don't see the curvature of the Earth if you are 2 millimeters above this beach ball. You just don't. That stuff is flat. That stuff is flat. That stuff is flat.
Not only that, you know, as they say, you know, as the area of our knowledge grows, so too does the perimeter of our ignorance. Mm-hmm. So.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and we didn't go there, and we did go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen. So in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going.
It looks bad to me. It's in space. Or is it? Is that it?
Yep, I think that's it.
Right in the middle.
Mark.
Oh no, it's going down!
Well, Mark.
You got like 3 feet of air that time.
Is that a plane or is it the rockets? Is that the rocket? Not bad. Is that what always happens? Does it always go right down?
Yep.
It looks fun to me. It's in space. Or is it? Is that it?
Yep, I think that's it.
Reality is insane. They want to keep us in chains. Plus they have a web of deception they weave in our brains. But now I see through the games. They're trying to lead us astray. Gatekeeping information, they want to keep it that way. But I'm researching all the time, every day of the week. So people claim that I'm crazy and I'm labeled a freak. But that's what happens when you're awake in a nation of sheep, where they try their best to keep the population asleep. They poison our food and water and they offer us war, but we're not falling for their parlor tricks. Not anymore. We walked through the door and let our chains drop to the floor. There's many areas in this life that we got to explore, and the earth too, because they might be hiding more lands, more seas, more trees, more snow, more sand. In school, everything that we're taught is a lie, and lately it's making me crazy. I gotta know why.
Well, why are there no monkey fossils? What, are you kidding me? I'm just saying. I just should have learned that way back in elementary.
Well, I think it looks so ridiculous and impossible.
That way back in elementary.
Well, I think it looks so ridiculous and impossible. And you can tell it's real because it looks so fake, honestly. Like, we'd have way better CGI if it was fake. And, you know, the colors all look kind of weird in space. There's no atmospheric occlusion. You know, like, everything looks too crisp. But we didn't really test any of those materials for, you know, is it space hardened or whatever, you know? So it just has the same seats that like a normal car has. It's just literally a normal car in space.
One. NASA's next spacecraft, already being built and tested across America, will do those things and more.
This is the spacecraft that's going to take humans to explore the solar system. It's the next big step for NASA in exploration.
Called the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle, or MPCV, this next-generation spacecraft will enable America to explore beyond low Earth orbit. 2.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
3.
Plan that NASA has is to build a rocket called SLS, which is a heavy lift rocket. It's something that is much bigger than what we have today, and it will be able to launch the Orion capsule with humans on board, as well as landers or other components to destinations beyond Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go, and this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to, and we're building these building block components in order to allow us to do that eventually.
4.
The kinds of technologies that we're testing out on Space Station are definitely helping us with our goals of going beyond low Earth orbit. So we have a really robust exploration program at NASA.
5.
And unlike the previous program, we are setting a course with specific and achievable milestones. Early in the next decade, a set of crewed flights will test and prove the systems required for exploration beyond low Earth orbit.
So how did we send humans to the moon 6 times so early on, but we can't figure it out in 2016? How was it so easy to go to the moon in 1969 using this flimsy lunar module? Even more interesting, who was already on the moon filming the arrival of the module? Was it the same person who stayed back on the moon and filmed the departure of the module?
Stage push. Engine arm is out there. I'm going to get the pro.
proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vents are good. Ag thought.
Just wondering. This is OD.
In school, I was just like you, probably all of you there. I tried my best. I didn't always succeed, didn't always do well, but I put my best effort into school. Math and science were kind of my favorite subject. I didn't really like English and reading too much, but I've since grown out of that, and I enjoy reading now. And I played a lot of sports. And all of that happened in a little town called York, Maine, across the United States from where we're talking to you right now. Hello, my name is Steve Owen. I'm a teacher here at Riverside Prep. York, Maine, across the United States from where we're talking to you right now.
That's a great question. There's almost 300 that will be conducted over the 6-month mission.
Okay, let's see that again, because didn't he just, well, you can decide for yourself. What exactly is going on here? Let's watch again. All right, maybe we need to hear the sound again. Not sure. What is he doing?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I kind of thought it was an important question myself, and I was just trying to think of what else could I be seeing here. And I've seen nasal sprays. They usually have like a trigger, like this, or they're obviously nasal spray bottles like this. But then I thought, wait a second, there's no germs on the ISS. They say people don't get sick there. They make sure that you're not sick when you go up. He'd been up there for quite a while. Therefore, there shouldn't be any germs up there. So why does he have allergies on the space station? Can't be allergies. And that stick looked kind of like, yeah, like a tutor. Now let's see what happened just less than a minute later. This is less than a minute after that little snort job.
Mission control, as well as designing the next generation of vehicles and equipment that we need in order to explore further. Over.
Hey, you want to get an 8-ball? It makes faking space a lot easier. All right, I'll get one.
And, well, we spend a lot of time taking pictures, playing with our food is nice, calling people on Earth and keeping in contact with our friends and family.
I think the glasses, when they get back from space, make a little bit more sense now. Don't you? And also, this answer takes on new meaning.
Well, we are doing everything we can to make life better on Earth, but with developing new drugs, finding ways to, you name it, we are trying. Everything we do here is either to make life better on the planet or to enable us to explore. Over.
Another interesting answer here is exactly how he got involved in space. Listen carefully. This is something I never knew and something that needs to be investigated.
I visited my grandpa who worked at Johnson Space Center when I was 6, and I saw the huge Saturn V and just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, and I wanted to know more, and then I just got hooked from that moment on, and I never looked back. Over.
Very interesting. Old Grandpa worked at Johnson, huh? I wonder if he liked Pepsi, or did he prefer Coke? Just wondering.
And I missed that last one. Could you say again?
So, I mean, it could have been anything, really. I mean, Jeff probably has allergies from all that pollen. That's my guess. I mean, he's clearly just an honest military man. He's got manners. I mean, that's why he ducks. He checks the monitor, and then he ducks out of the way of the camera before he sniffs his Afrin. Makes all the sense in the world. Don't know about you guys. I don't think there's anything to worry about.
I'm sure the $53 million a day is going to, better humanity.
The earth was flat. I said, man, you must be crazy. Where the hell is your tinfoil hat? But he spoke with such conviction, and he believed the words he spoke. And something deep inside me knew this couldn't be a joke. But why would he believe this? Or why believe such things? Because everybody knows the earth's a ball and that it spins. Well, you must be pretty crazy if you think the earth is flat. Because we all know that it's a globe, and that's a simple fact. So I said, what about the photographs that NASA takes from space? He gave a knowing smile and told me, man, those things are fake. But what about the videos that I've seen with my two eyes? What about them? He replied, have you heard of CGI?
Hi, I'm Noah. I'm in second grade. Could you throw a somersault right now?
Is a close-up view of the equatorial region of Saturn. I think it's very interesting, and it caused quite a bit of comment here in the Mission Operations Center. First of all, the block in the upper right has no meaning. That's an artifact introduced into the image as we display it here by the computers that process this spacecraft data as it comes from the spacecraft. So the part we're interested in is the portion below the middle of the screen, the lower half of the screen. And what we're seeing there is a portion of the cloud tops of Saturn near the equator, and the stripes that we see to the left that move diagonally from the left up toward the upper center are a backlighted view of Saturn's rings. But the most interesting thing, perhaps, is the shadow these rings cast on the surface of the cloud tops of Saturn. Time is 9:03 and 40 seconds. Right now, 20 more seconds, and we will be able to confirm the spacecraft has survived. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have a mission. The Pioneer Saturn spacecraft has survived the crossing of the ring plane. We are fucking science, bro.
Take a listen. I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Security is going to be a very big factor with respect to space and space exploration. At some point in the future, we're going to look back and say, how did we do it without space? The future of American space leadership, we're going to lead again. It's been a long time. It's over 25 years. Today, we're taking a crucial step to secure America's future in space by reviving the National Space Council after it has been dormant almost 25 years, if you can believe it. Today's announcement sends a clear signal to the world that we are restoring America's proud legacy of leadership in space. We're going to look back and say, how did we do it without space? Vice President will serve. At some point in the future, we're going to look back and say, how did we do it without space? The Vice President will serve as the Council's chair. The privatization of certain aspects is going to play a very crucial role, don't you think? They are truly into it. I will say that's not easy because everybody wants to be on this board. People that you wouldn't have believed loved what we're doing so much. They want to be some of the most successful people in the world want to be on this board. The human soul yearns for discovery. By unlocking the mysteries of the universe, we unlock truths within ourselves. That's true. Our journey into space will not only make us stronger and more prosperous, but will unite us behind grand ambitions and bring us all closer together. Wouldn't that be nice? Can you believe that space is going to do that? I thought politics would do that. Well, we'll have to rely on space instead. Every launch into the skies is another step forward toward a future where our
unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? To the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr., and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th, and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass, and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Call Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, roger for
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we were saying. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, A crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18th, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue gas. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up, and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second...
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
You want me to knock you in the head?
Well, I want you to swear to God on the Bible that you walked on the moon.
Okay.
If you walked on the moon, we're given the opportunity to swear to God that you walked on the moon.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to get the hell knocked out of you if you don't leave me alone.
So
publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay? I mean, do you have Neil Armstrong interviewed already?
No, he doesn't want to be interviewed.
Well, I know.
Why does he not give interviews?
Well, because that's his personal choice. And I guess it's mine, in a way, to do things when they've been researched and worked out as far as a business arrangement. This is not news. This is not an anniversary.
Well, actually, it is. We found a very unique reel of footage that we have queued up to show you.
Yeah.
And it's from the mission. And to our knowledge, no one has ever seen it before. And it's 30 years old.
And you want me to see this while you have me on camera?
Well, and to tell us what it is. I mean, it's...
Well, I don't know why I should do that.
It's a very unique footage.
It may be that I need to see it, and then we sit down and we talk about what you're taking a picture of. I don't see where there's an advantage in it for me to do what you're asking me to do. I see all sorts of pitfalls. I see people who have managed to talk to somebody. Who did you talk to in our office?
I talked with Heather at Tor Books.
Yeah, but is this helping book promotion? Are you going to be putting anything out during the time that I'm marketing books? See, Heather does not represent me for the things you're talking about. She represents a book selling activity.
I think when you see the footage, you'll see that it's very extraordinary, one of a kind, behind the scenes type of footage.
Yeah. Well, if it is, why do you have access to something that no one else has seen before?
Serendipity, I guess. And it was recorded on the 18th
of what?
Of July, 1969. Do you remember this?
On the 18th?
Apollo 11, Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light. And we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow. We can see the oceans with a definite blue cast. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth. Roger, the ATC is working real well. The F-22 looks good, over. Hello, Apollo 11, Houston, did you copy, over? Roger, we copied, Charlie. Roger, your transmissions the last couple of times have been about 2 by, over. Okay, how do you read me now? Roger, 5 by now. Now we're coming in. Can't quite make out who that had.
What is your proposition that we didn't go to the moon?
I know for a fact that you did. I know for a fact that you did not.
You know for a fact that we did not.
That's correct, and you'll see this tape proves that.
Okay, well, I'm not interested in satisfying your suppositions when there's all this evidence that we did.
This proves, as you see, that you're using the window to demonstrate that you were halfway to the moon when you were
Turn the camera off, please. Turn the camera off.
It shows that you're in Earth orbit. Now, if the moon is 3 days away, and this is late,
on the 18th, how could you possibly walk on the moon 2 days later when this was shot on the 18th?
You want me to sit in front of a camera while you're taking pictures, you're showing this, and then you want to see my reaction?
I know for a fact
that's slimy journalism. Do you realize that?
If
you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
The document that I have in here, you'll find that it's not. But this is a personal plea to do what is right.
Well, we sit and we talk about things ahead of
This
time.
is the document that you want to see. I know for a fact.
But what it is you're trying to do is unethical. You don't believe that?
No, I do not.
Well, then we have a difference of opinion.
This is where you're using the window of the spacecraft to appear to be the Earth far away. We got the raw footage of it. We have an auxiliary track, so in prompting you will speak.
You believe in UFOs?
No,
you believe we've been visited by... Well, why do you want to believe this stuff?
I know for a fact. We've had this analyzed. And this is the window. And you're in a stated by an atomic clock at the Goldstone tracking station, which is on the tape.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. Why don't you talk to the administrator in NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight. We're not...
I know for a fact this didn't happen. And this tape would prove it in a court of law. It would.
Why don't you try? Why don't you put your money into a court of law and see how people laugh at you? You want it...
No one has laughed.
Is your camera working?
No one has laughed.
And this makes you the real famous person that has discovered this and reveals all this stuff. What an ego you must have to want to propel yourself like this.
That's not why I'm doing it, and God knows that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for the truth to come out because I think it was wrong.
You can also notice how the
Well, but you're doing it the wrong way. You don't mislead somebody like me to come in here.
If you didn't go to the moon, that's misleading people. I'm showing you this tape.
We went to the moon. We're not misleading anybody.
Then how is it possible that this is the window? It's shot to make it look like...
Look, you can manufacture all you want with
this
these
is straight. This isn't manufactured.
Sure.
Did you know that it isn't?
that of an interior of the astronauts at work.
I believe this would prove it in a court of law that you did not go to the moon. You stated on the 18th. It proves when you remove the...
You give me your business card.
It's all in there. It's all in there.
Not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert.
This proves that it's the window. You can see them removing the crescent insert that you did to create the Terminator line in front of
You're
the
so
window.
full of shit, I can't believe it. If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
What was the temperature like in the spacecraft on the moon?
Well, the lunar module that was the vehicle that we landed on the moon, it was just like this room we're sitting in here right now. We had a thermostat, and it worked a little different than the air conditioning in a house or a building. However, it had the same effect. So if it was too hot, we moved it up a little cooler, and so we could get just the right temperature we wanted. Now, when we put on our spacesuits and closed them up, then we had a backpack on, and in that back was essentially an air conditioner too, a different kind, a kind that would work in a vacuum, and then we could keep our suits the right temperature, because human beings, even though we got a lot of good capabilities, you know, our brains are amazing, our eyes are amazing, we don't perform well if we're not within a really narrow temperature band. If we get too hot, we sweat, we don't do well. If we get too cold, we shiver and we don't do well. So it's important for human beings to have temperature control. And of course, we do that on Earth real well.
If the LEM didn't have climate control, and had air in it, would it be hot or cold without the climate control?
If you just took a lunar module, and well, let's take the climate control and it fails. All right, what happens then, you've got air sitting there, it's 70 degrees. If the lunar module is setting in the sun, which it always is, then slowly but surely that temperature inside is going to go up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you ain't going to make it because you're going to cook long before that.
What powered the air conditioning?
What powered the air? Batteries. You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module. They powered pumps, they powered the air conditioning, they powered the communication system, and that's the reason we were only able to stay on the moon 33 hours. Later on, we got a little better batteries, more batteries, and we could stay longer. But batteries turned out to be, for the weight involved, the thing that gave you the power. Now, the best. Now, the command module, which had to last from the moon and back 10, 12 days, then batteries would have been too heavy. And so we used fuel cells there, which took hydrogen and oxygen and put them together and made electricity. So it depends on, like in a car, you wouldn't want a fuel cell now because a battery can do the job. But if you were trying to replace the engine, maybe you could use some fuel cells to drive the motors. Be too expensive now, but maybe someday.
What was the power of the engine that descended to the moon?
The rocket engine?
Yeah.
The rocket engine that we used to descend to the moon was a very simple rocket engine. It operated at low pressure so that it was like running your car at 30 miles an hour, not running your car like a race car. The engines we used to launch from Earth was like running your car at race car speeds, you know. So everything had to be just right. But we were interested in safety paramount right there. We didn't have last-minute checks we could do. We only had one engine. It couldn't fail. So it ran at lower pressure. And when you were in it, you couldn't hear it in the vacuum of space.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No. Now, I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
Beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo.
I don't know the distance to the Van Allen radiation belt. And if we did, it wasn't a problem. If we were going to encounter it, then we would have had to build the spacecraft and the spacesuit to not give humans a problem. You don't just build something and hope it works. You study to see what the threats are, the environment is, and then you say, how thick do I have to make the metal on the spacecraft so that going through this kind of radiation or these kind of meteoroids, it won't get hurt. And we build it that way.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
We went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
We didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it inside, and we didn't get any, added radiation.
In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report, noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects.
No strange occurrences?
Nothing like that.
The space shuttle...
Go ahead.
The space shuttle went to 365 miles a few years ago. Because I worked in news, I saw CNN. They said that the radiation belts surrounding Earth are more dangerous than previously believed because the astronauts saw shooting stars with their eyes closed. Just when they got within 600.
Radiation belt. We saw shooting stars, but they're not shooting stars with your eyes closed, although they look like it. If you're out in space beyond the Van Allen belt, and probably within the Van Allen belt, and close your eyes and just pay attention. You don't notice it unless you pay attention. Then all of a sudden you'll see a little flash like a shooting star, except it's like that. There goes one this way. Then one just blossoms. And then not that fast. Maybe you wait 3 minutes or 2 minutes and one goes whoosh. And what's happening is cosmic rays are hitting the back of your eye and exciting those sensors in the back of your eye. So that's what you see. And they got high enough apparently to close it. My guess is in Earth orbit, if you closed your eyes and just paid attention, that you would see them.
The first time they were seen was when they went to 365 miles.
Yes.
That's 650 miles below or away from the radiation.
Yeah, see, it's below. My guess if they just did it tonight. But see, if you're just going to sleep or closing your eyes or it's dark, you don't notice them. But if you'll close your eyes and pay attention, which we had an experiment to do, by the way, then you see them whistling by. Not on our mission, by the way, they hadn't been discovered yet. I saw them one day on the moon. It wasn't dark, and it was kind of dark, and I saw this flash of light, and it looked like it was on the moon, but really it wasn't. It was a flash of light in my eye.
Yeah.
Set it up, man. The government, man.
Spying on you. Yeah, so, like, when I first heard about the flat earth theory, obviously I've heard it before. My father, going back, when I was young, he told me that he was a member of the Flat Earth Society.
Your father told you that?
Yeah.
Was he joking around?
Kind of, but what he was doing it in a kind of satirical way, ironically. He was doing it because, like, he was like saying people are too sure of themselves, and so I'm going to join the Flat Earth Society. He didn't believe the Earth was round.
So it's been around for quite a while, the Flat Earth Society.
The Flat Earth theory has been around. Obviously, like, thousands of years ago, people thought the Earth was round, and then slightly fewer thousand years ago, people figured out that it wasn't. It was figured out by the ancient Greeks, like 3,000 years ago, that it wasn't. And by the
that it wasn't round.
That it wasn't flat. Sorry.
Oh, you fucked it up. You gave up the goose. You said thousands of years ago that people thought the Earth was round, and they realized it wasn't.
Yeah.
You just right now you gave them fuel.
That's a quote that's going to go on YouTube.
Fucked up.
Like my I am a shill quote.
Yep.
From the last one. Strike that one.
A slight misquote.
Yeah. So yeah, what happened was science basically figured out the shape of the universe, and in the 1800s there was like gentlemen scientists doing all kinds of cool things with stars, like measuring the orbits and checking out how far away things were and discovering that there were galaxies and things like that. There's all this science going on. But then there was this kind of this guy comes along called Samuel Rowbotham, who published under the name of Parallax in about 1860, and he started publishing what is basically the same as Eric Dubé's book that's being published now. Pretty much every single thing that is in Eric Dubé's current book, you will find in Samuel Rowbotham's book from 1860. And in fact, if you read Dubé's book, which I don't recommend, you will see that about 80% of the text of Eric Dubé's book is actually quote.
troposphere, the tropo layer, then the strato layer, meso layer, and then the thermo layer. And as you can see, thermo is cold, so I call that the ice area, and fire is hot, so that's where the fire would be. But you know, you would think at first that the moon would be in the meso layer, and that's what I thought. But I think they're both up here, and that's based on a video I just watched again, actually, from an amateur rocket launch, a Go Fast rocket that was launched in 2014. When you watch that video, the rocket takes off, cameras pointing down. For some reason, cameras are always pointing down and never up, which would be nice if you could see what's going on when they're going up. But anyway, cameras pointing down, rocket takes off, and pretty quickly the rocket starts spinning around like crazy. I mean, you can see the fins and you can see the ground spinning. It might make you dizzy if you stare at it too long. So the rocket's spinning as it's traveling up. And about 1 minute into the flight, it suddenly just stops. Rocket just stops, and that spinning stops, everything just stops, and it just kind of sits there for a second.
Yeah, copy. We are not getting telemetry from that last song. Please stand by.
And some people have suggested that it hit a dome that may be above us, but I thought at that velocity it would have been destroyed. So I didn't think much of it when I originally watched it, but I have to thank a guy named Jeff who just sent it to me again, because it really put some pieces together for what I was working on with this. And when you watch the video, the rocket just stops. And so I started looking up the stats. That rocket went over 3,500 miles per hour on that trip. Now, it might not have been going that fast when it stopped, but it was going a few thousand miles per hour at least, and it just, all that energy just suddenly, where did it go? Rockets don't have brakes. It literally stops, and I mean, the rotation keeps going a little bit, but all of that angular momentum from the rotation of the rocket and the linear momentum from flying up just stopped. No, it had to have hit something. solid surface, the rocket would have been destroyed, and most likely the camera too, so we wouldn't have the footage, and obviously that's not the case. So when you start watching it, around that time, around a minute in, a few seconds later, the two stages separate. It's a two-stage rocket, it looks like, and you watch the bottom half of the rocket start to fall down, as you would expect. But then the upper half, the way the camera's mounted to it, starts spinning around, and very slowly it starts to fall back towards Earth. Very slowly. And you might think, well, I have it up here, the Go Fast rocket got up to about 117 kilometers. And outer space is considered in the thermal layer. Once you cross into the thermal layers, technically you're in outer space. But what doesn't make sense is, just because you fly vertically into outer space doesn't mean that you're just going to float there. That's not how it works, based on the heliocentric model. If you watch Balls Out Physics Episode 3, I talked about how you have to have an orbital velocity, and these orbital velocities are incredibly fast. You have to be orbiting the Earth to resist the force pulling down on you, gravity, weight, whatever you want to call it, that pulls down on you. You have to do that. You have to do, basically, this string is gravity. Just to show this again, if you haven't seen that, you have to be moving at a high velocity to resist that force. That rocket went straight up, so it should have fallen straight back down. Now, just to see what the acceleration on that rocket should be, assuming very thin, almost no air up here, because that's what's supposed to be there, I did a calculation at 117 kilometers plus the radius of the Earth, and I found that the acceleration towards Earth, due to gravity, if you want to call it that, or due to weight, should be roughly 9.46 meters per second squared. That's not much. That rate is pretty close to the rate at sea level, which is 9.81 meters per second squared. So it should have basically done this, but it didn't. It stops, and then it just kind of slowly starts sinking, like it's in water or some type of liquid. That's what it looks like. If you really start watching it, the way those pieces are falling, if you get to about 2 minutes and 10 seconds in, you see the other stage, the lower half of the rocket, still slowly tumbling down like it's in water.
I mean, what's your scientist, what's your data?
I think, I've had a lot of letters saying that, and
There are 8 billion people in the world, Dr. Dawkins. How many letters have you had?
No, I haven't done that. That's quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I put it as something like, 99% against or something.
Well, how do you know it's 99% against, say, not 97%?
No, I did. You asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it?
No, of course not.
So it could be 49%.
Well, it would be. I think it's unlikely, and it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right. How did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto, perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Well, but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view?
Certainly. I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And
a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament.
Nothing like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like Vishnu?
How can you ask such a question?
You don't, right?
How could I? I mean, why would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in the Muslim God?
No. I mean, why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with anything that I've said.
I assume. Yeah. I'm just wanting to make sure you don't believe in any God anywhere.
No.
What if after you died you ran into God? He said, "What have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? I've been trying to be nice to you. Yeah. I gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did."
Bertrand Russell had that point put to him, and he said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
And they've asked me some interesting questions, like, they've heard that that space is very hot. That when you go up above the atmosphere, the temperature of space is millions of degrees, which is true. The problem is there's basically no air at all. So I mean, the gas right around the Earth is actually millions of degrees hot. That's actually true. But there's almost none of it. There's almost nothing. Like one single proton whizzes by you at a temperature of 1,000,000 degrees. It's not the same as temperature, like in the air. It's not the same thing at all.
Here is a map of ancient Egypt. I've inserted 2 sticks, or obelisks, one up here in Alexandria and one down here in Syene. Now, if at a certain moment each stick casts no shadow at all, that's perfectly easy to understand, provided the Earth is flat. If the shadow at Syene is at a certain length, and the shadow at Alexandria is the same length, that also makes sense on a flat Earth. But how could it be, Eratosthenes asked, that at the same instant there was no shadow at Syene and a very substantial shadow at Alexandria? The only answer was that the surface of the Earth is curved. Not only that.
There was a famous experiment conducted by Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes. And the 2 cities in the old world, and one of them, they knew that at 12 noon on a particular day of the year, that the sun was directly overhead and you can see the bottom of a well.
Oh, okay.
You don't run around looking at the bottoms of wells.
No.
Because the light doesn't take, it's just, no.
Doesn't get down there.
Doesn't get down there. How can we use this observation to see if Earth's surface is curved? we needed another well. Turns out we can't see the bottom of both wells at the same time. What might explain this? Well, there are two possible explanations. First, we could have a flat Earth. We could have a flat Earth with a sun that's small and close by, so that the light hits the second well at an angle.
The only answer was that the surface of the Earth is curved. Not only that,
we could have a flat Earth with a sun that's small and close by, so that the light hits the second well at an angle.
.3D software to model the experiment. Eratosthenes' claims are still considered evidence, even though his method is not reproduced routinely and his measurements could not possibly be accurate. People who have tried to reproduce his shadow experiment showed that it works on a flat surface with a smaller and closer sun like the one we can see, and with a curved surface and a very far away and larger sun.
Eratosthenes measured could be explained by a flat Earth if the sun were only a few thousand miles away and 32 miles across. The math would work out the same.
The problem that often escapes the perception of Eratosthenes' proponents is that we can film the sun growing and getting smaller throughout the day as it moves closer during sunrise and farther at sunset. This was initially denied since in the ball Earth model, the sun's size could never change, but the photographic evidence that the sun does indeed change sizes during the day is by now overwhelming. And there's a video by this guy, Wolfie, who is claiming that the sun is not changing sizes, and you can go and download that video and put it in the software, get the beginning and the end of the video, and you will see that there is a change in the size of the sun. And it is done with a solar filter with the idea that there's no change because there's no glare. But in fact, there is a change if you measure it. And I've done that.
So, as the area of our knowledge grows, so too does the perimeter of our ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Where a reflection of the sun would move around, which I'll show you in my experiment coming up. Right now, see, it's locked in its position on the cloud. It is not moving. It is moving, even though the camera's moving up and down, side to side, that reflection should be following the eye and the camera.
Reality is insane, they wanna keep us in chains. Plus they have a web of deception they weave in our brains. But now I see through the games, they're trying to lead us astray. Gatekeeping information, they wanna keep it that way. But I'm researching all the time, every day of the week. So people claim that I'm crazy and I'm labeled a freak. But that's what happens when you're awake in a nation of sheep, where they try their best to keep the population asleep. They poison our food and water and they offer us war, but we're not falling for their parlor tricks, not anymore. We walked through the door and let our chains drop to the floor. There's many areas in this life that we got to explore, and the earth too, because they might be hiding more lands, more seas, more trees, more snow, more sand. In school, everything that we're taught is a lie, and lately it's making me crazy, I gotta know why. This twisted mental conditioning, I offer my message to anyone out there who's listening. I hear just beyond the limits and it's calling me whispering. Sometimes I feel like I'm tripping, this has got to be just a dream. But nope, I'm wide awake, my friend, and this is reality. Why do we let them enslave us, man? It beats the heck out of me. People barely scraping by and work for minimum wages. There is no new world order, this is how it's been through the ages. Flip through the pages of history and see on your own. Too many things are a mystery, other things are unknown. It makes me question who we are, where we live and what we're told. But walking a path of truth can be a really bumpy road. We're ridiculed, mocked, and we're ostracized and laughed away. But that's okay, some folks are sheep until they pass away. In school, everything that we're taught is a lie, and lately it's making me crazy, I gotta know why. Fire burning in my soul. This twisted mental conditioning, I offer my message to anyone out there who's listening. I hear just beyond the limits and it's calling me whispering. Sometimes I feel like I'm tripping, this has got to be just a dream. But nope, I'm wide awake, my friend, and this is reality. Why do we let them enslave us, man? It beats the heck out of me. People barely scraping by and work for minimum wages. There is no new world order, this is how it's been through the ages. Flip through the pages of history and see on your own. Too many things are a mystery, other things are unknown. It makes me question who we are, where we live and what we're told. But walking a path of truth can be a really bumpy road. We're ridiculed, mocked, and we're ostracized and laughed away. But that's okay, some folks are sheep until they pass away. In school, everything that we're taught is a lie, and lately it's making me crazy, I gotta know why. Fire burning in my soul.
The Flat Earth Man album is out right now. Oh, this is thinking everything that you Mr. Flat Earth Man. Thank you. Listen up. The whole world's a stage and you're in the audience, and everything you see on the stage is fraudulent. Nothing you see before you is fact. Are you ready for your headline act? This act is truly one of a kind. They'll dazzle you and play tricks on your mind. An illusionist with billions of fans. Please welcome NASA. Put together your hands. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so lovely to see you again. Tonight we have a very special show. There's a few things we want you to know. Tonight we reveal some of our techniques. We'll expose NASA like WikiLeaks. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we'll show you how we fool the world. And when we're done exposing our lies, none of you are gonna realize, even though we're gonna tell you straight, it'll be too hard for you to contemplate. A trick so huge you won't believe, impossible for you to conceive. That's why we tell it, 'cause you'll reject it. A lie so big you